1937, 12 August 1968, remote mountain outpost, Central Vietnam. The jungle was alive with whispers I couldn't place, not the usual chatter of cicadas or distant artillery. Something different, something patient. My boots sank slightly into the mud, and I froze mid-step, straining to hear. A twig snapped. Far off, maybe 50 meters. No, closer. Silence again, thick and suffocating. This was our base, carved into a ridge high in the Annamite Mountains. Small, isolated. 7 of us holding a precarious line against whatever lurked beyond the tree line. We had our orders, recon missions, report VC movement, survive until extraction. But that night, the mission felt secondary. I felt eyes on us, something watching, calculating. My hand rested on the M16 sling. Every hair on my neck bristled. If you've ever wondered what it's like to feel hunted in a place where no man should ever set foot alone, then this story will take you there. I've shared a lot over the years, but what happened in those mountains, what I survived, isn't in any official record. Not entirely. Stay with me as I recount the patrol that came face to face with something no one could explain. Something the military never wants anyone to know existed. I'm Specialist First Class James Hawk Callahan, 5th Recon Company, U.S. Army, Vietnam, 1968. When you think of recon patrols in the Central Highlands, you imagine quick strikes, invisible movement, and living like shadows in a jungle that's older than memory itself. Our base was perched on a steep ridge, north of Kontum, surrounded by dense foliage, jagged limestone peaks, and a river that wound like a silver snake through the valley below. The jungle air was thick with humidity, heavy with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves, the kind that clings to your clothes and hair no matter how often you wipe. Our team was small but highly trained. Sergeant Mills, a grizzled 35-year-old with eyes like burnt steel. Corporal Nguyen, a local scout with uncanny intuition for the jungle. Private First Class Smitty Michaels, a rookie with hands too steady for someone who'd never been under fire before. Specialist Doc Reynolds, our medic and a walking encyclopedia of field survival. And the rest of us, 6 soldiers who had learned to read the jungle like a second language. We were assigned to a forward observation post to monitor enemy supply movements along trails known to the North Vietnamese Army. But even in the middle of a tactical operation, I knew something was off about this place. The outpost itself was rudimentary. Bamboo and canvas huts, a single generator for lights and radios, sandbags stacked along the perimeter, and a few clay foxholes carved into the ridge's steep face. Visibility was almost non-existent past 20 meters because of thick undergrowth, and at night, the jungle swallowed sound and light alike. From our vantage, you could see the valley floor below, but it felt more like peering into an abyss than watching an enemy line. The wind that funneled through the ridges carried odd noises, something heavier than monkeys, something that made a low, guttural rhythm with every gust. At first, we chalked it up to mountain fauna, but soon the noises grew more deliberate, almost intentional. On day 1, I noticed subtle signs that the place wasn't empty. Broken branches arranged unnaturally, shallow depressions in the mud that didn't match any of our boots, faint scratches on tree trunks that looked more like claw marks than machete cuts. Nguyen was the first to comment, whispering that the mountain had eyes, a saying I dismissed at the time, figuring it was superstition. But the impression lingered. Even the local birds avoided the area. Their absence was deafening, and the silence only seemed louder in contrast with the jungle's usual chaos. We conducted routine checks on our gear and perimeter each morning. Radios were spotty, sometimes fading into static even when fully charged. Dogs at the base were restless, growling at nothing, ears flat, eyes fixed on the tree line. Sergeant Mills kept a tight lid on panic, emphasizing standard operating procedures. Maintain radio discipline, keep your sectors covered, trust your instincts, and never venture alone beyond the wire. Still, I felt a creeping unease. A predator, real or imagined, seemed to be testing us, probing for weakness, and I couldn't shake the sensation that we were already being watched. Despite the unease, we settled into routines. Morning patrols along the ridges, afternoon observation in hides, and night watches where one man always stayed alert. We joked to keep spirits up, calling it the Ridge Blues. but every joke was undercut by the tension you could feel pressing down like humidity itself. The jungle was a living entity, and something in it was far from ordinary. As I lay in my bunk listening to the rain pounding the tarp overhead, I couldn't help but notice patterns, odd sounds at specific times, shadows that didn't match the trees, fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond the light of our lamps. By the end of that first week, I realized that if whatever was out there was intelligent, it had learned our habits, and patience would be its ally. The mountain held secrets that even the Vietnamese locals whispered about in hushed tones. Tales of things that were larger than any animal, creatures that moved silently, and eyes that glowed like lanterns in the night. We were soldiers, trained to deal with ambushes, snipers, and the unpredictable chaos of war. But this felt different. This wasn't the NVA. This wasn't the jungle itself. It was something else, something older, something that seemed to know the boundaries of our base better than we did. That night, lying awake in my hammock, I made a silent promise: observe, survive, and never underestimate the mountain. Little did I know, that promise would be tested far beyond anything we could have imagined. By the second week, the jungle had begun to feel less like a living environment and more like a predator's lair. Nighttime patrols, once routine, became exercises in restraint and observation. The first sign came late one evening, just after the generator died for no discernible reason. I was on watch near the northern wire, M16 across my lap, when a faint rustling started just beyond the bamboo perimeter. At first, I assumed it was the wind carrying leaves against tree trunks, but the rhythm was too deliberate. 3 quick snaps followed by a pause, then a low, dragging thump. Every instinct in me screamed that we weren't alone. Nguyen was the first to notice changes in animal behavior. The dogs refused to leave the perimeter, growling at nothing, ears flat and low to the ground. Birds, which usually sang at dawn and dusk, had gone silent for nearly 24 hours straight. Even the monkeys that hung from the treetops near the ridge seemed to vanish, leaving the forest unnaturally quiet. It was subtle at first, easy to rationalize. Mountain wildlife is unpredictable, but when Smitty noticed a shallow depression near the tree line that resembled a giant paw print, our casual explanations began to fade. The print was far larger than anything native to the region, roughly the size of a man's torso, with claw impressions that dug deep into the mud. Equipment began to act strangely. Radios emitted bursts of static at random intervals, even with fresh batteries. Our generator sputtered, cutting out mid-watch before restarting on its own. Night vision goggles fogged inexplicably despite the dry canopy, and infrared scopes picked up heat signatures that weren't human, or at least not entirely human. Sergeant Mills started keeping log notes of these anomalies, insisting on multiple perimeter sweeps each night. He didn't mention it aloud, but the lines etched deep into his forehead hinted at his own growing unease. Even the simplest tasks, cleaning weapons, checking tripwires, felt charged, as though invisible eyes were following each motion. The first direct evidence of something observing us came when Doc returned from a supply run outside the perimeter. He carried 3 water cans and a crate of rations, only to find that one of the cans had been punctured and drained entirely. Nothing else in the area seemed disturbed. Animal? He suggested, but none of us had ever seen a predator capable of such precision. The puncture marks were small, neat, almost surgical. Something was testing us, or maybe marking territory. The unease that had been simmering since day one now had a sharp edge. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Radios went silent, unless someone intentionally keyed up the transmitter. Every footstep sounded heavier than it should. Every rustle became a threat. Visual cues became harder to ignore. Shadows in the jungle seemed to move independently of the moonlight. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of something between the trees, a form larger than any bear or tiger in the region, hunched, moving with unnatural grace. It didn't make noise when it moved, and yet when it vanished from sight, the jungle felt hollow in its wake. On more than one occasion, a team member would stop mid-step, eyes fixed, whispering, "Did you see that?" Only to have nothing there when the rest of us turned to look. Even in daylight, the forest seemed to conspire against our perception, hiding details in thick foliage, creating fleeting patterns that mimicked human forms. By the end of the 3rd week, small injuries began to accumulate. Smitty returned from a night observation with shallow lacerations across his forearms, which he claimed came from a misstep in the underbrush. But the cuts were uniform, like claws dragging across his skin, and the surrounding leaves bore tear patterns inconsistent with normal vegetation. It wasn't an accident. The predator, or whatever was out there, was close enough to make contact without revealing itself fully. Arguments broke out over the authenticity of these events. Some wanted to treat it as superstition. Others feared voicing their concerns outright. Only Nguyen remained silent, scanning the tree line with the kind of patience that betrayed years of local survival knowledge. Even routine tasks became exercises in heightened awareness. Every time we walked to the latrine, hauled water, or patrolled the outer wire, we moved in pairs, covering each other's blind spots. Tripwires were laid and checked daily. Generators were inspected, radios logged. We could no longer distinguish between normal jungle anomalies and the deliberate movements of the predator. The environment itself seemed to mock us. Leaves rustled where no one stood. Fog drifted in unnatural pockets along the ridges, and the low hum of insects carried in a rhythm almost synchronized with our heartbeat. By the end of those early signs, one thing was clear. Whatever was out there wasn't just observing, it was studying us. By the fourth week, the sense that we were being studied had become impossible to ignore. What had started as subtle signs, claw marks, strange tracks, fleeting shadows, now manifested in patterns that seemed intentional. Equipment went missing or was tampered with during brief patrols. Tripwires triggered without disturbance, and even our traps set for wildlife were found sprung, empty, or destroyed. Sergeant Mills began keeping a nightly tally of anomalies: broken water cans, punctured rations, scratched tents. Each day the numbers grew, a quiet reminder that something large, silent, and patient was watching us. The injuries continued. Smitty reported more scratches and shallow gouges along his legs after a night watch. They weren't deep enough to stop him, but enough to draw blood. At first, we assumed thorns or jagged branches, but Nguyen examined the wounds and shook his head. "Not plant," he said quietly. "Claw, small, but strong." The realization hit us simultaneously. Whatever this was, it could strike without revealing itself. And it had been in our perimeter, moving between us like smoke. Each of us started paying closer attention to our fellow soldiers, making sure no one strayed alone. Tension built not just from fear of the unknown, but from the realization that the predator's reach was precise and deliberate. Disagreements erupted over interpretation. Some soldiers insisted these incidents were the work of night animals or just the jungle playing tricks, while others, Nguyen and I, knew the behavior we were witnessing defied normal wildlife patterns. Smitty became jittery, whispering about something in the trees watching me, while Mills tried to maintain command authority but could not hide his own mounting anxiety. The friction between logic and instinct created an invisible rift among us. Patrols became hyper-cautious. Even mundane chores like water collection or latrine runs were paired with calculated observation. Nothing could be taken at face value anymore. The physical environment began to reflect the predator's presence more overtly. We found trees bent in unnatural ways, broken branches placed in arrangements that suggested more than random damage. Some rocks near the perimeter were stacked, forming subtle markers or signals. Tracks of varying sizes appeared overnight. Some small, matching human feet, others massive, with claw impressions set too far apart for any animal we knew in the highlands. At first, we recorded these tracks for evidence, then stopped. Recording them felt futile. By morning, some prints were gone. Others altered as if the jungle itself had been rearranged overnight. Even our cameras, set for surveillance, produced blank frames or flickering images, capturing only glimpses of darkness where movement should have been. We adjusted tactics to account for the mounting threat. Night watches were extended, overlapping sectors covered by 2 or 3 men at all times. We reinforced sandbag positions and laid more tripwires along likely entry points, but every morning revealed the predator's ability to circumvent our precautions. The air carried a metallic scent at times, blood or something like it, but we never found the source. At night, distant growls and low, guttural sounds punctuated the stillness, sometimes moving across the ridge with unnerving speed. Even the dogs refused to leave the bunkers, ears flat, teeth bared. One evening, Nguyen whispered, almost to himself. It's learning us. None of us laughed. None of us could. By the end of that phase, the base had transformed from a temporary observation post into a cage under siege. Every movement, every sound, every shadow was suspect. We could no longer trust the jungle as a neutral environment. It had become a weapon wielded by an unseen hand. The predator wasn't just hunting. It was teaching us fear, measuring reactions, and shaping the battlefield according to its own design. It was no longer a question of survival from enemy troops. It was survival against something intelligent, patient, and unrelenting. The stage was set for the first encounter, and none of us would ever be the same after the mountain made its presence known in full. It happened on the 5th night. The jungle had grown impossibly still, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel like an intrusion. I was paired with Nguyen, patrolling the perimeter along the northern ridge where the tracks had first appeared. Our flashlights carved thin beams through the dense foliage, illuminating nothing but the occasional twisted tree trunk and creeping vines. That's when I heard it, a low, wet hiss, followed by a sound like stones dragged across the ridge. Nguyen froze, signaling me to stop. I could feel the hairs on my arms bristle as the faintest outline moved in the undergrowth, barely distinguishable from the shadows. Its form was massive, hunched low, with elongated limbs that seemed too long for any known predator in the region. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of glinting eyes, reflecting an intelligence that wasn't human. I shouted a warning to the rest of the base, my voice cracking, and the generator sputtered again, throwing us into near darkness. By the time the others reached us, the creature had vanished, leaving only broken branches and a metallic tang in the air, blood or something like it. The first attack wasn't fully physical. Smitty, on night watch near the south perimeter, reported that his gear had been shredded while he slept, his rucksack slashed in half with surgical precision. He insisted he saw a shadow moving across the ridge, but by the time anyone could respond, it was gone. Doc examined the shredded equipment and found no teeth marks consistent with any known animal. The cuts were clean, angled, almost deliberate. For the first time, we realized the predator wasn't just stalking. It was testing, probing our defenses with a level of cunning that was terrifying. The partial sighting on the northern ridge forced immediate procedural changes. Sergeant Mills organized a rapid response perimeter, radios crackling as we coordinated positions. Each sector was covered by 2 men, overlapping fields of fire. Tripwires were reinforced, and flare guns readied. Nguyen scouted ahead, moving like a shadow, eyes scanning for the faintest movement, while I covered him with my M16, finger on the trigger. Every sound, the whisper of wind, the snap of a twig, set our nerves on edge. We began to notice patterns. The predator avoided open terrain, moved silently, and seemed to study our habits with patience, retreating whenever we reacted aggressively. Emotionally, the encounter fractured us in subtle ways. Fear had always been present, but now it was tangible, turning into tension that crackled between words. Smitty, once confident on patrols, flinched at shadows, whispering that the eyes never left him. Mills tried to maintain calm, barking orders, but I could see doubt flicker in his expression when a branch broke too far off the ridge for any of us to reach. The predator had made contact without fully revealing itself, and the psychological toll began to outweigh the physical threat. Even our dogs cowered, ears flat, growling at empty space. By the end of that night, we had no concrete kill, no captured tracks, nothing but the shredded gear and a lingering sense of dread. But the predator had left a calling card, evidence that it could strike anywhere along the perimeter, silently, efficiently, and without fear of retaliation. The jungle itself had become its ally, obscuring its presence, amplifying its menace, and teaching us the lesson that survival would demand more than weapons or discipline. Something intelligent and patient was on the ridge, and the first encounter had proven it. We were no longer simply soldiers in enemy territory. We were prey being observed by a hunter who understood us better than we understood ourselves. That night, as I lay in my hammock listening to the rain pounding the tarps and the distant rumble of the valley below, I thought about the fragility of our positions, the thin barrier between life and disappearance. The predator had made itself known, but never fully. Its movements, its precision, its intelligence, all remained a puzzle. I realized that surviving in these mountains wouldn't just be about defending against enemy forces. It would be about reading, anticipating, and outlasting a presence that had studied us long before we even set foot on the ridge. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The nights that followed the first encounter were a descent into chaos. The predator had tested us once, and now it seemed to have escalated. Generators failed with alarming frequency, leaving us in near total darkness. Radios emitted bursts of static when we tried to communicate, cutting off sectors from each other at critical moments. Even our flashlights seemed to falter. Batteries drained inexplicably, forcing us to rely on the thin light of the moon and the dull red glow of our chemical lamps. Every patrol, every movement outside the perimeter, became a gamble. One night, Smitty and I were sent to check a trap line near the eastern ridge. Halfway there, the undergrowth shifted as if alive. Something charged across the trail, knocking down branches with incredible force. My adrenaline surged, and I opened fire, but the shots hit nothing. Whatever it was moved faster than any animal I had ever seen, disappearing before we could even track its retreat. By the time Wynn arrived to assist, we realized we had been separated from the rest of the team. The ridge, once familiar, now felt alien. Every shadow, every rustle, every faint scent suggested danger. Injuries began to mount. Smitty's arm was cut by what looked like a claw as he scrambled over a fallen log. I suffered a deep gash across my shoulder when the underbrush seemed to reach for me, the thorns sharper than any jungle vine should have been. Doc worked tirelessly, applying field dressings and monitoring for shock, but the psychological strain was as dangerous as the physical. Fear had become tangible, a force pressing down on every movement. Sergeant Mills ordered tighter formations, but the jungle's natural obstacles made cohesion difficult. Trees, fog, and uneven terrain favored the predator, and it exploited every weakness. The predator's intelligence became clearer with each attack. It avoided open ground, struck with precision, and retreated before we could respond effectively. Tripwires were found bent or cut, sandbagged positions disturbed, and we began noticing faint patterns. Areas we reinforced were ignored. Areas we assumed safe were targeted. It wasn't random, it was calculated. The creature seemed to be manipulating us, pushing us toward exhaustion, exploiting fear. Every night brought a new variation of attack. Sudden loud snaps in the distance, shredded tents, missing supplies, faint glowing eyes peering through fog, and tracks that appeared and vanished before we could follow. By the end of the first week of escalation, team members began to vanish briefly, only to reappear disoriented and shaken. Wynn swore he felt himself being followed even during daylight, and Smitty's confidence collapsed entirely. He jumped at every shadow, refusing to patrol alone. Even Sergeant Mills, normally steady under pressure, confided quietly that he had never encountered anything like this, that even the most disciplined jungle unit could falter when faced with an adversary that defied every expectation. The jungle had become a maze, and we were being hunted inside it. The base itself reflected the chaos outside. Sandbags were torn, equipment destroyed or missing, tripwires snapped, and tents shredded in patterns we could not interpret. The generator and radios became unreliable, the fog thicker, the shadows longer. We began improvising defenses, stacking heavier branches as barricades, laying improvised alarms using tin cans and trip lines, and maintaining overlapping patrols at all hours. Every man was on edge, every shadow a potential threat. Sleep became impossible, and the predator's presence was inescapable. It was patient, intelligent, and relentless. And as I stared into the dark canopy one night, I realized that this was no longer a simple survival mission against enemy soldiers. The mountain had its own resident, and it was slowly, methodically breaking us down. It was the 7th night since the first encounter, and the jungle had become a trap of shadows and whispered threats. The predator struck with precision, its patience finally giving way to aggression. Around midnight, during a routine perimeter check, we noticed that one of the southern foxholes had been disturbed. At first, it looked like nothing more than careless digging, but then Smitty screamed. The ground beneath him collapsed, revealing a shallow pit littered with broken branches and torn fabric from a previous patrol. Whatever had been here had left no tracks, no footprints, only evidence of its passing and a lingering metallic scent that made my stomach turn. As we tried to regroup, a series of distant snaps and hisses echoed across the ridge. Nguyen signaled for silence, and we froze, trying to locate the source. Then, from the tree line, a low growl rolled through the fog, deep and resonant, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. It was close, closer than we thought possible. Smitty, panicked, shined his flashlight toward the noise, and for a split second, a hulking figure darted across the ridge, too fast, too agile for any animal native to the region. The glimpse lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough to freeze us in place. One by one, the predator began its attack. Tripwires snapped, alerting us too late. Shouts rang out as gear was thrown, radios crashed into silence, and a flare ignited briefly, revealing its shadowed form. It wasn't aiming to kill immediately. Instead, it tested our reactions, forcing us into mistakes. Doc rushed to Smitty, who had tripped over a fallen branch while fleeing, only to find the space where he had been standing now empty. The predator had taken precise, calculated steps, striking in moments we were most vulnerable. Fear had become an acute weapon. In the chaos, Sergeant Mills tried to coordinate a response, ordering overlapping sectors of fire and calling for regroup, but the creature, or creatures, I wasn't sure, moved faster than our coordination could manage. Our sandbags were shredded, a tent collapsed, and several pieces of equipment were destroyed. Every time we thought we cornered it, it vanished, leaving only the smell of iron and the haunting sense of observation. The predator seemed to anticipate our movements, retreating when confronted and reappearing where we least expected. By the time the flares burned out, 2 men were missing from the line, separated in the confusion, and the ridge was quiet once more, except for the echoes of our own ragged breathing. Improvisation became our only option. Nguyen suggested a makeshift barricade along the central ridge, using bamboo poles and trip lines, while Doc tended to the minor injuries inflicted during the attack. I stayed near the perimeter, scanning the fog for any movement, my finger on the trigger, heart pounding. We realized then that the predator had a methodical way of isolating individuals, exploiting fear, and exploiting terrain to its advantage. This wasn't random hunting, it was tactical, almost military in precision. Every escape it allowed was deliberate, every missed strike a lesson in patience. By dawn, we were exhausted, bleeding from minor cuts and scratches, and emotionally frayed. Smitty refused to move without Nguyen or Mills nearby, and even the dogs avoided leaving the bunkers. The ridge, once our stronghold, felt like a cage under siege. We had survived the first major engagement, but the cost was steep. Equipment ruined, team trust eroded, and the psychological impact of being watched and tested was undeniable. The predator had revealed a fraction of its capability, and I knew, deep in my gut, that the confrontation was far from over. It had made its intentions clear. We were prey on its mountain, and every night forward would be a battle not just of skill or firepower, but of wit, patience, and endurance. The night of the peak encounter began like so many others. Fog rolling across the ridge, thick and cold, muffling every sound. We were on edge, knowing the predator had already tested us multiple times, learning our routines, exploiting our weaknesses. Sergeant Mills had organized the perimeter with overlapping sectors of fire. Flares lit along key points, and a backup generator humming faintly in the background. Despite these precautions, the jungle felt alive in a way that no patrol briefing could prepare you for. Every leaf, every shadow, every flicker of movement carried a weight of impending danger. It started with a distant, guttural roar that rolled through the ridge, vibrating the ground beneath our boots. The dogs erupted, barking and growling at invisible assailants. The first attack was sudden and precise. A massive shadow burst from the tree line near the western perimeter, lunging over a sandbag barricade and slamming into Smitty. He went down hard, screaming, and I fired point blank, the muzzle flash illuminating the form. Long, muscular limbs, hunched shoulders, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It vanished almost instantly, leaving only Smitty gasping for breath and clutching deep claw marks across his chest. I felt the first real surge of terror, not from the creature's appearance alone, but from the realization that it could strike anywhere, anytime, with intelligence guiding its attacks. We attempted to regroup, but chaos spread faster than our coordination. A second figure, or perhaps the same predator moving impossibly fast, targeted Nguyen as he attempted to reinforce a tripwire. It moved silently, then struck, dragging him toward the undergrowth before Sergeant Mills could intervene. We fired blindly, the sound deafening in the dense fog. When the echoes faded, Nguyen was gone, the jungle returning to an eerie silence punctuated by our own ragged breathing. It became immediately clear. Whatever this was, it wasn't just hunting. It was strategizing, isolating members, exploiting our fear, and forcing us into reactive positions. Our defensive positions were systematically compromised. Sandbags shredded, tripwires broken, flares knocked over or extinguished. Equipment, previously intact, was torn apart, radios smashed, ammunition boxes slid open, as if to demonstrate dominance rather than to simply steal. We tried to follow tracks, but the mud yielded nothing consistent. Prints appeared and disappeared, some impossibly large, some deceptively human. The predator was a phantom, leaving destruction in a pattern that defied logic and conventional animal behavior. Every movement we made seemed anticipated, our fears weaponized against us. The engagement became personal when the predator, or predators, repeatedly targeted isolated soldiers. Smitty, already injured, was forced to crawl behind sandbags, firing erratically into the shadows. The glowing eyes we had glimpsed before now seemed everywhere, reflecting in broken equipment, appearing briefly in fog pockets, vanishing when approached. At one point, I saw a figure leap from one ridge to another, covering distance no human or known animal could manage. The agility, the precision, and the apparent intelligence of the creature left us paralyzed with a mixture of awe and terror. Doc was overwhelmed, tending to injuries. Claw marks, deep scratches, and bruises were everywhere. Blood stained the fog, glinting faintly in flare light. Attempts to mount a counterattack were hindered by the terrain. The ridge was steep, slick with mud, and obscured by dense vegetation. Every shout or shot seemed to draw the predator closer, or at least provoke movement designed to terrify rather than kill outright. Fear had become as much a weapon as claws or jaws. By now, it was clear that the predator had learned our patrol patterns, our weakest points, and even our emotional reactions. Every man was aware of the stakes, yet the fear was contagious, spreading like wildfire through the perimeter. At the height of the encounter, multiple attacks occurred simultaneously. One predator, or several, emerged from the eastern ridge, charging Smitty and Doc, scattering gear, flipping tripwires, and forcing us into improvised positions. Mills barked orders, trying to hold our formation, but coordination was nearly impossible under the relentless pressure. Flashlight beams crisscrossed the fog, illuminating glimpses of muscular, hunched forms moving faster than our eyes could track. It was hunting with a level of strategy that suggested intelligence. It avoided the full force of our fire, struck quickly, and disappeared into the shadows before retaliation could succeed. By the time dawn began to break, the ridge looked like a battlefield in miniature. Sandbags were shredded, tents collapsed, flares burned out, and supplies strewn across the mud. Casualties were high. Smitty was bleeding heavily, Nguyen was missing, and several others were limping from minor but cumulative injuries. Doc moved between us, trying to stabilize wounds while we scanned the fog for any remaining threat. The predator had disappeared, as if satisfied, leaving only the wreckage and the haunting sense that we had not survived by skill alone, but by the creature's decision to spare us, for now. As the sun broke over the mountains, illuminating the fog-blanketed valley below, silence returned. It was a fragile, eerie, quiet, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. We were exhausted, terrified, and disoriented, but alive. The predator had revealed its full capability, and we understood for the first time that this was no ordinary animal. It was intelligent, patient, and dangerous beyond comprehension. And the knowledge that it was still out there, watching, waiting, and learning, weighed heavily on every man's mind. Survival was no longer about tactics or firepower alone. It was about understanding, predicting, and enduring a presence that may have been there long before us and would remain long after. By the time sunlight pierced the fog, the ridge was unrecognizable. Sandbags were shredded, tents collapsed, gear scattered and ruined, and the ground was a mix of mud, blood, and broken vegetation. We were bruised, bleeding from superficial and deeper wounds, and utterly exhausted. The predator had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the destruction it had wrought and the lingering metallic scent of blood. Every one of us knew the nightmare wasn't over. It was only a pause between assaults. Doc moved methodically, checking each of us for injuries. Smitty's claw marks ran deep across his chest and forearms, his breathing shallow and uneven. Nguyen was still missing, presumed dragged into the thick undergrowth during the chaos, and Mill's face was lined with exhaustion, a hard mask masking the fear none of us dared speak aloud. We patched wounds with what remained of our field medical supplies, wrapping arms and legs, disinfecting deep scratches, and improvising splints for minor fractures. Even with treatment, the emotional toll was worse than the physical. Shaking hands, wild eyes, and silent murmurs filled the ridge. The perimeter had to be re-established immediately. We reinforced sandbags, checked tripwires, and organized overlapping patrols to cover every possible approach. The jungle was no longer a neutral environment. It had become a weapon wielded by an unseen, intelligent force. Each man was hyper-aware of his sector, scanning fog pockets, shadowed tree lines, and the flickering light of damaged flares. Every sound, branch snapping, leaves rustling, distant animal cries, was amplified in our minds. The predator's message was clear. Survival depended on vigilance, coordination, and endurance. Sergeant Mills attempted radio contact with the nearest forward operating base, hoping for reinforcements or evacuation. Static answered him, and when he finally got through, the reply was vague. Maintain position. Reports incoming. Minimal engagement. Copy? It was frustratingly bureaucratic, almost deliberately so, as if the higher-ups were unwilling or unable to understand the gravity of the situation. Still, it was enough to remind us that we weren't alone, that the larger command structure existed, but that immediate relief would not come. The ridge was still ours to defend, and it was clear the predator had no intention of giving us a reprieve. We gathered in what remained of the central tent to debrief, listing missing gear, injuries, and unaccounted personnel. Fear had transformed into tense, disciplined focus. Smitty's hands trembled as he recounted his narrow escape, and Mills tried to maintain morale, emphasizing the importance of maintaining operational readiness. But beneath the veneer of control, the psychological strain was obvious. Every man had seen something impossible, survived something that defied logic, and knew the predator could return at any moment. Our confidence had been replaced by a gnawing awareness of vulnerability. By late morning, the ridge had stabilized enough for basic routines, though caution remained. Patrols continued in pairs or trios, flares were spaced to maximize coverage, and every man carried a loaded weapon with steady fingers and scanning eyes. The predator had demonstrated its intelligence, patience, and strength, and we knew it could strike again with precision. We survived the peak encounter, but the cost was clear. Lost personnel, shredded equipment, and fractured morale. Even as we worked to restore some sense of order, the jungle seemed to close in, whispering through the fog, a constant reminder that the unseen threat had not left, and perhaps never would. By mid-morning, a helicopter arrived, carrying a small contingent of command personnel and a new set of orders. Relief was short-lived. Within hours, it became clear that the priority wasn't debriefing or reinforcing our perimeter. It was sanitizing the event. Sergeant Mills, already fatigued, received sealed envelopes marked classified and for command eyes only. We were instructed to provide written statements, carefully worded, omitting certain details, and emphasizing enemy engagement rather than the inexplicable attacks. Every shred of evidence, the shredded tents, claw marks, oversized tracks, and missing personnel, was cataloged, photographed, and reinterpreted for official records. I remember Nguyen being the first to quietly protest, his voice low but firm. "This isn't the NVA. This is something else. They won't understand." His words were swallowed by the tension that had settled over the ridge. We were soldiers, trained to follow orders, yet every instruction now clashed with the reality of what we had experienced. The presence of the predator, the destruction, the precise attacks. It all had to vanish from official memory. Our reports were rewritten to minimize the threat, attributing injuries and damage to environmental hazards or enemy action. We were complicit in a narrative that erased the truth, and the weight of that complicity pressed on us with every dictated paragraph we signed. The higher-ups made their presence clear in subtler ways. A sergeant from command warned us not to speak of strange activity outside the ridge. Cameras were confiscated, notes sealed, and even field sketches of claw marks or tracks were collected. The implication was unmistakable. Discuss these events, and consequences would follow. Fear shifted from predator to bureaucracy. The jungle had been dangerous, but now the world beyond the ridge posed a threat as well. Smitty, already fragile from his injuries, began showing signs of paranoia, whispering that the officers were just as dangerous as the predator itself. Even as we continued patrols, our perception of the jungle changed. Every footprint, every rustle, every shadow carried a dual weight. The predator still lurked, and the official narrative demanded we ignore or reinterpret what we saw. The lines between survival and secrecy blurred. We began to see subtle patterns in command behavior, avoided questions, sudden changes in orders, and reluctance to investigate further. It became clear that the predator wasn't our only adversary. The official response had become a second layer of danger, demanding compliance and silence as we continued to live on the ridge, haunted by what had occurred. Paranoia started infiltrating even routine tasks. Each patrol became not just a defense against the unseen predator, but also a psychological exercise in managing fear under the scrutiny of higher command. We began second-guessing each other, worrying who might inadvertently reveal the truth, who might break under pressure. Even within our small group, trust began to fracture. Mills tried to maintain cohesion, emphasizing discipline and obedience. But beneath the surface, we all felt the tension of being both hunted and monitored. The predator's threat was no longer purely physical. It was now entwined with secrecy, fear of reprisal, and the slow erosion of morale. By the time the helicopter left, taking the higher command and classified materials with it, we were left in a strange limbo, survivors of a confrontation that no one outside the ridge would acknowledge. The predator remained in the jungle, unseen but ever present. Our wounds healed slowly, but the psychological scars were immediate and pervasive. We had survived, but at the cost of truth. The cover-up had begun, and with it came the subtle, constant anxiety that nothing we experienced would ever be recognized. In the back of my mind, I knew that the predator would continue its observation. And now the human element, the silencing, the rewriting, the denial, had become an additional threat to our survival and sanity. After the official cover-up was in motion, the ridge felt even more isolating. The predator had disappeared for now, but its presence lingered in the broken sandbags, clawed trees, and faint metallic scent that never fully dissipated. Nguyen and I began our own, unofficial investigation, documenting every anomaly we could remember: shredded tents, oversized tracks, punctured gear, and the patterns of its attacks. Each record was careful and coded, hidden in a notebook we buried near the central tent. We knew the higher command would never acknowledge it, but preserving the evidence felt like our only act of defiance against both the predator and the bureaucracy. Equipment that had survived the peak encounter was inspected and re-inspected. Muddy footprints appeared overnight, sometimes partially erased, sometimes altered to confuse us. We discovered that some of our improvised tripwires had been bent and reset, indicating the predator had been near our perimeter, even when we thought we were alone. At times, I swore I could hear movement outside the bunkers, soft footfalls, the whisper of leaves, not matching any man on patrol. The sensation was chilling, knowing it could be anywhere, observing our attempts to regain control. Beyond the physical evidence, subtle psychological effects took hold. Team members grew jumpy, flinching at shadows or sudden noises. Even moments of quiet were uneasy. The jungle felt like it had been fundamentally altered, haunted by the predator's methodical stalking. Smitty refused to walk alone. Nguyen scanned every ridge and tree line constantly, and Mills maintained an iron grip on discipline, though the tension in his voice betrayed exhaustion. We realized the predator's influence extended beyond injuries. It had reshaped how we thought, moved, and trusted each other. Survival had become as much a mental exercise as a physical one, Attempts to report new observations were always filtered through command channels, resulting in vague or dismissive replies. Equipment malfunctions, unusual tracks, and strange sightings were downplayed or classified under generic enemy activity reports. We began to understand the scale of the cover-up. Higher command was more concerned with appearances than reality. Some evidence simply vanished. Photographs misplaced, notes confiscated, and logs altered. It was frustrating and terrifying. Our only documentation of the predator's behavior risked being erased entirely, leaving the mountain and its unseen predator untouched by official memory. By the end of this phase, we had learned to move in silence, leaving fewer traces, and observing patterns of the jungle as carefully as we observed each other. The predator was patient, and so were we, documenting what we could, aware that our records might be the only proof of what transpired. Even months later, the ridge continued to offer subtle warnings: misplaced branches, footprints that didn't match known animals, and fleeting glimpses in foggy mornings. The consequences of that encounter were ongoing, a reminder that some threats, both natural and bureaucratic, don't end with a single night. Survival was a continuous struggle, and every trace of the predator and the cover-up carried lessons we could not ignore. Years later, the ridge remained etched into my memory, though the physical evidence had long disappeared. Official reports labeled the events as enemy skirmishes and equipment malfunctions, and the documents we tried to preserve were sealed or destroyed. Yet, in my mind, the predator's presence never left. Even decades after leaving Vietnam, I could feel the subtle anxiety it had implanted, the instinctive glance at shadows, the prickling awareness of unseen movement. It was a psychological imprint, one that no official narrative could erase. Sleep remained elusive. I dreamed of the ridge, of clawed trees and shattered sandbags, of glowing eyes cutting through fog. In these dreams, the predator appeared again and again, its form always partially hidden, leaving only enough detail to confirm it was neither human nor animal. Occasionally, I would wake with the metallic scent in my nostrils, or the faint sound of leaves snapping under unseen weight. My body remembered the tension before my mind fully acknowledged it, and even mundane movements, walking through a dark hallway, stepping onto uneven ground, could trigger the same hyper-awareness that had saved my life on the ridge. The predator's influence extended beyond personal trauma. Small, unexplained phenomena continued to follow me. Equipment malfunctioned in inexplicable ways. Dogs reacted to unseen presences, and fleeting shadows mirrored the movements I had learned to anticipate in the jungle. Each incident reinforced the lessons learned in Vietnam: patience, vigilance, and respect for the unknown. I began documenting these occurrences privately, in journals hidden from family and colleagues, aware that the truth existed in layers, some visible only to those who had experienced it firsthand. The contrast between official records and personal truth became increasingly stark. Military historians, reports, and declassified files spoke of skirmishes, jungle hazards, and lost equipment. None mentioned the calculated precision of the attacks, the subtle intelligence behind the predator's movements, or the mental toll exacted on the survivors. In my private reflections, however, every detail mattered. The metallic tang of blood in the fog, the tracks that appeared and disappeared, the way fear became a weapon used against us. The gap between what the world accepted and what we endured grew wider with each retelling, isolating those of us who had truly survived. Even decades later, the ridge, the predator, and the lessons remained alive in memory. I could trace the path of fear, recognize the signs in everyday life, and anticipate subtle threats with a reflex honed on that mountain. The predator's presence had become both a warning and a teacher, reminding me that survival is never guaranteed, and that truth is often hidden beneath layers of denial, bureaucracy, and fear. The long-term impact was clear. The ridge had not only shaped our survival, but had reshaped the way I perceived the world, danger, and the unseen forces that exist just beyond the edge of comprehension. The years following my return from Vietnam did little to ease the weight of what I experienced on that ridge. Sleep remained fragmented, haunted by half-formed shapes and glowing eyes in the corner of my vision. Ordinary noises, a snapped branch, a dog's bark, the hum of an air conditioner, triggered the same hypervigilance that had saved me in the jungle. Even in crowded rooms, I felt the predator's presence, an invisible pressure reminding me that awareness, caution, and fear were inseparable companions. Guilt began to take root. Survivors like Smitty and I wrestled with the memory of Juan, still missing, presumed lost in the thick undergrowth. Every decision we had made on patrol, every lapse in judgment, felt magnified in hindsight. I questioned whether I could have done more, moved faster, fired differently, or kept the team closer together. Nights spent alone were punctuated by imagined whispers, subtle sounds that forced me to relive those peak encounters repeatedly. The predator's influence extended beyond physical danger. It had embedded itself in the psyche, a constant reminder of both human fragility and unseen intelligence. Isolation became a defense mechanism. Friends and family were kept at a distance. The truth was too heavy, too alien to share. Even casual conversations triggered flashbacks, fogged valleys, shattered sandbags, clawed trees. Ordinary stressors were amplified by the memory of the ridge. I found myself rehearsing every encounter, visualizing patterns, tracking shadows in the corner of my eyes. Over time, these behaviors became compulsive, checking locks, scanning tree lines during hikes, and reacting instinctively to small, unexplained movements. The predator's lessons, caution, patience, attention to detail, had become survival mechanisms applied to civilian life, often to the point of exhaustion. Triggers emerged in the most mundane places. A sudden gust of wind through the treetops, the metallic scent of blood in a grocery store, or the flicker of car headlights across the bedroom wall could set off a cascade of fear and heightened awareness. My body remembered the ridge even when my mind tried to dismiss it. Heart raced, muscles tensed, and the familiar urge to seek cover or scan the environment returned, long after any danger had passed. Friends noted my irritability and hyperfocus, but they could never understand the origin of my reactions. The predator had taught vigilance in the most extreme form, and that lesson never ended. Despite the paranoia and survivor guilt, there was an odd sense of purpose in this deterioration. Awareness became survival instinct, and vigilance became a way to honor those lost. Each flash of fear, each triggered memory, reinforced the understanding that danger often exists beyond comprehension and documentation. While the official narrative denied the existence of the predator, my memory held it vividly, and every day served as a reminder of its intelligence, patience, and relentlessness. The psychological deterioration was not just suffering, it was a permanent imprint of survival, a constant readiness to confront the unseen threats that linger long after the immediate danger has passed. Even decades later, the predator's presence remained a ghost in my life. It wasn't always physical. Sometimes it manifested as fleeting glimpses, partial shadows, or disturbances that defied explanation. A foggy morning on a remote trail could trigger a visceral memory of the ridge, and in that instant, I felt the eyes watching, the patient, calculating intelligence lurking just out of sight. The lessons learned in Vietnam had not faded. I moved with caution in ways ordinary people would never notice, scanning tree lines, listening for impossible sounds, and instinctively avoiding areas where the unseen might strike. Reports of strange sightings and disappearances in other mountainous regions began to catch my attention. Hikers, local patrols, and other veterans described shadows moving unnaturally, flashes of glowing eyes, or the sudden shredding of tents and equipment. Though geographically distant, these accounts mirrored our experiences on the ridge. The pattern was clear. The predator, or its kin, was not confined to a single location. Its presence was persistent, patient, and intelligent, exploiting fear and environment in the same calculated way we had endured. Every story reinforced the idea that what we had encountered was part of a larger phenomenon, one the official narrative refused to acknowledge. Sometimes, I would see traces too subtle for anyone else to notice. A claw mark on a tree during a hike, oddly disturbed foliage in a foggy valley, or the metallic scent of blood in the wind would trigger the same hyper-awareness as if I were back on the ridge. These encounters were brief, almost ghostly, but the implications were terrifying. The predator had endured longer than our patrol, had survived scrutiny, and had learned patience in a way that made human intervention almost irrelevant. My memory, sharpened by decades of vigilance, recognized patterns others dismissed as coincidence, and in those moments, the mountain and the predator felt closer than ever. The lingering threat was also psychological. Even in secure, ordinary environments, the anticipation of its return shaped behavior. Doors were double-checked, windows scanned, and peripheral vision constantly monitored. Friends and family noted anxiety, hyperfocus, and occasional paranoia, though they could never comprehend the true source. The predator had left an imprint deeper than physical injuries. It had rewritten the instinctual perception of danger. Any sudden sound, shadow, or unexplained movement could reignite the survival reflexes forged on the ridge. The threat was no longer just about presence, it was about what its existence had taught us. Fear, patience, and vigilance were inseparable from life. Despite the years and distance, the predator remained an active, if unseen, force in my awareness. Every ridge, forest, and fog-filled valley carried the possibility of its observation. The encounters on that Vietnamese ridge were a lesson in the persistence of unseen predators and the fragility of human perception. And though time has passed, the vigilance learned, the psychological scars endured, and the subtle signs of its presence continue to warn that survival is never guaranteed. Some forces are patient, enduring, and invisible, and the predator remains, always watching, always calculating, waiting for the next moment to strike or test its prey. Looking back, I realized the predator was never just a physical threat. It was a lesson in patience, intelligence, and the fragility of human perception. The ridge, the destroyed sandbags, the claw marks, and the missing men, all of it was a testament to an unseen force that defied conventional understanding. Even decades later, the events remain vivid, replaying in dreams, fleeting shadows, and the occasional metallic tang in the air. The mountain taught us that some dangers cannot be catalogued, fought, or fully explained. They can only be endured, studied, and respected. What haunts me most is the silence that followed each encounter. The predator never roared when leaving. It never taunted us with a final strike. It observed, tested, and vanished, leaving only destruction and doubt in its wake. And the official cover-up ensured that no one outside our patrol would ever know the full story. We were trapped between the visible and the invisible, the documented and the forgotten. In surviving, we carried not only physical scars but also the weight of secrets, the gnawing knowledge that the predator remained, patient and calculating, somewhere in the fog of the mountains. To anyone watching this, there's a warning I wish I could deliver in person. Vigilance matters, even in places that seem safe, and some forces, intelligent, patient, unseen, exist beyond our understanding. The ridge is gone, the base abandoned, but the lessons remain. If you hike alone, if you explore dense valleys, if you step into fog-filled forests, remember that some predators don't announce themselves with growls or attacks. They wait, they watch, and they learn. Survival is as much about awareness as it is about skill, and sometimes the unseen will be closer than you think. Stay vigilant,